is my pleasure to take off my hosting hat and put on my moderator hat right now, and introduce to you, of course, two people who really need no introduction. But our next fireside chat is with Brad Garlinghouse. He is Ripple CEO, as you know, and we're also joined by Jameson Greer, partner at King & Spalding. He's former chief of staff to Ambassador Lighthizer in the Trump administration, really part of the team that investigated China's IP theft that led to the current U.S.-China trade tensions right now and the wave of tariffs that we've seen. But from my perch here in Asia and really reporting for a global audience like you all, and really bringing in on insights as we're covering the space from our perch, what's happening in China is really making us take note. It's keeping us and our editorial team very, very busy. And it's becoming clear that there is a tectonic shift, wouldn't you say, gentlemen, a tectonic shift happening in blockchain innovation. So who's in the, when it comes to the US and China, who's ahead?
Well, I'll give a shot at answering that to start off. First of all, thank you. Nice to see you again. And Jameson, nice to see you as well. I think that we are seeing some very forward thinking and really, not just multi-year forward thinking, but maybe multi-decade forward thinking in how China has looked at and been strategic about their engagement in crypto. And I think in some ways I'm in awe of it. I think they're realizing that some of these technologies may in fact be very foundational for the future of how financial systems work. And they want to make sure that they have capabilities at the heart of them. And so in many ways, my hats go off to them.
Jameson, you've been working in this space from an IP front. You've noted, just what of some of the transgressions, obviously, but there's a lot of innovation happening. And so whether or not that transgression is now turning into innovation, and where does that technology take us? Your view?
Yeah, I think that's right. Frequently in the United States, we focus on intellectual property, trade in goods, trade in services, and we say China's killing us on these things. But it's not often enough that we think about really the architecture of digital payments and digital currency. China is using, in a lot of ways, the same playbook that they've used on the industrial side here, and so we need to be concerned about that too.
If I might jump in, Angie, if you don't mind, I think just so we're all kind of operating from the same set of facts, if you will. The reason why I say I think China is ahead in some ways because, I think the US is behind. And I think the most tangible example of that is when the US government gave regulatory clarity to Bitcoin and Ether. And this was 2 years ago now, more than 2 years ago. The director of corporate finance, Bill Hinman, gave a speech providing clarity that the SEC did not view Bitcoin and Ether as securities. It made it accessible, and so that different platforms, different exchanges, even we just saw an ad before we started from ErisX, different players to say, oh, okay, now there's clarity around that, so we can invest in that. Well, I also think that follow the blockchain and crypto world are aware that today, because of the mining control of Bitcoin and Ether in China, these are technologies controlled by China. And, I think 25 years ago, the US was a leader in making the internet what it is today. But part of that came from regulatory clarity. Part of that came from the Telecom Deregulation Act in 1996. We have that opportunity in front of us now with blockchain, but I haven't seen the US kind of lean into that. And instead, in a world where we see all kinds of concerns about Huawei and 5G networks, we're 3 years from now, you can imagine the exact same headlines about these next generation of payment technologies.
Well, that regulatory clarity there was no doubt about it when in October of 2019, Xi Jinping essentially in his remarks basically pinned blockchain innovation as part of the economic growth that China was going to implement over the course of the next 5 years. That became very clear. We've seen since then a blossoming, if you will, an explosion, some would say, of 35,000 blockchain companies registering in China. And then on the other end, here in the US, we have a lot of, great leadership at regulatory agencies, many of whom spoke today, but at the same time, it is absolutely so fragmented. And even amongst commissions like the Securities Exchange Commission, you really have almost a split of, or even just like a fragmentation of depth of understanding or even perspective. How do we get clarity on that from the U.S. side?
Well, let me give you an example, and just to pile on a little bit about your point that you just made. We just saw this week out of the Southern District of New York, a case involving Kik, and without talking about the merits, the point the judge made is there's not a lot of binding precedent in this area. And is that really how we want to approach blockchain and crypto regulation in America? Randomly through the courts, or do we want to have a concrete approach by the CFTC, for example, of letting folks know how will this be regulated, from the IRS, how will this be taxed, right? We need to know these things, have that clarity that Brad was talking about.
I'll also highlight there are some U.S. regulators that I think are being more vocal, and frankly, we could also talk on a global basis. There's certainly other governments and regulatory dynamics going on in other countries. Here in the U.S., though, I would highlight, the interim lead of the OCC is a guy named Brian Brooks, who used to be the general counsel at Coinbase, and a very, very impressive resume prior to that. And his role now at the OCC, I think you are seeing the opportunity to take a more aggressive role in advancing fintech companies. You saw at least some careful but support from the CFTC that came out recently around crypto futures. So, you're seeing some of that. Even not that long ago, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, CFPB, highlighted how digital assets, and actually specifically calling out how XRP can be used in a way to help significantly lower the cost of cross-border remittance. So you are seeing examples of this, but a lot of this, even the CFTC had to kind of delicately step around needing clarity from the SEC first. And until that clarity exists, I think there's going to be a lot of examples where we're going to lack the U.S. investment without that clarity.
Well, as the head of Ripple, there's no doubt, like, not only do you have to have a great command of the technology, but you also have to have a great command of policy and diplomacy, one could say. I mean, you're talking about global payments, you're talking about cross-border payments. And so here in Asia, what is your experience, Brad, when it comes to the policy, when it comes to regulatory versus what you're experiencing in Europe and the US?
Well, it really is, I think, very country specific. And so it's hard to talk about, Asia broadly sometimes. You're certainly seeing interesting dynamics in India recently, where the Supreme Court overturned the Reserve Bank of India's ruling banning financial institutions from providing services to crypto companies. That got overturned, but then I think, as I have read anyway, the RBI has re-engaged and kind of said, well, wait a minute. So, it's hard to paint anything with a broad brush, both here in the US and broadly, but you are seeing leadership from countries like Japan and Thailand and Singapore across Southeast Asia and Asia that really are taking a leadership role in providing clarity. And I think our engagement at Ripple with these players has very much been in the spirit, which at times has made us controversial within crypto, even relative to the panel that was on previously. Ripple has always taken the approach that, hey, we're going to work with banks, we're going to work with governments. And, the kind of days of Silk Road and scammy ICOs, I think is way behind us. But I still think sometimes I see an attitude around important regulatory frameworks like KYC and AML and OFAC compliance. This idea around, hey, we're going to move fast and break things. That doesn't work so well when you're talking about financial systems. That doesn't work so well, in my judgment, when you're talking about mission critical kinds of regulatory dynamics like KYC that I think we can't ignore and are important.
And I think, Sorry, Angie. I think that's the world we want to be in, right? We want to be in a world where the United States, in coordination with other, Western developed countries, and folks in Asia and other continents who are being responsible, that's the world we want to be in, where it's regulated in a way that allows innovation and allows the technology to really flourish. What we don't want is a situation where China's way out ahead of everybody. They have a central digital currency, and they're imposing that on other countries, and they're using it for whatever purposes they have. We don't want to be in that world.
That's kind of what's happening, though. I mean, right now you've got China's got a 4 to 5 year lead. The People's Bank of China have been actually researching and investigating digital currencies for a couple of years. We've heard about it for the past two at least. We know now that DCEP, digital currency electronic payment, the digital RMB project is in a pilot phase right now across 4 cities in China. We know that everyone from the Ag Bank of China to Didi Chuxing is implementing that. We've already seen the speed of adoption when it comes to Alipay and WeChat and digital currency payments infrastructure happening across China. But to your point, Jameson, does this displace the global hegemony spot that the U.S. dollar currently resides in? And beyond China, there have been calls to create a more balanced global hegemony currency. Calls from Mark Carney in Jackson Hole, of all places, for him to actually reveal these remarks. So where China's out ahead. There's no doubt about that. And then Jay Powell essentially saying we still have to study it first. And so where are we? Where are we in this race?
Well, I really think it is a China versus others race. I think Mark Carney's remarks are not particularly realistic. It's hard to get everyone in the world on board with something like that. But I think we have time too. I agree with Brad. We've heard from a lot of regulators today who are really interested in moving forward in a positive way. We've heard that they're cooperating and speaking with industry more and having the right conversations. I think it was Winston Churchill who said the Americans try everything else before they try the right thing out. I don't think we have a lot of time, but I think it's going in the right direction.
Brad, do you think we have time?
I think we have time. I think most of these technologies, look at the internet. It's played out over 20 plus years, and I think that's likely to happen here as well. But I think we all have to start from the same viewpoint. And from my point of view, the U.S. is effectively an all-out technology and economic Cold War with China. And I think that's likely to get worse, not better. And I think if we don't recognize how the position we're in today, it's kind of that old adage: if you don't understand the problem you have, you can't fix it. I think the SEC's inaction is helping China succeed and hurting other neutral technologies, certainly in this case some U.S. companies. And so I think that it's been 2 years since we heard from the SEC, since Bill Hinman gave his speech saying, but one of the things he said in that speech was, hey, we're happy to help the industry work through these issues. Here we are 2 years later, and while I think the SEC has taken a bit of a machine gun to the ICOs, many of them were fraudulent and many of them needed to address that. We can't develop policy just through enforcement. We need to develop policy constructively and kind of forward thinking, allowing for that innovation. Because if we try to apply these Byzantine securities laws to crypto, to digital assets, we're going to smother innovation. And that's at the advantage to the Chinese controlled technologies around Bitcoin and Ether.
I recently spoke to Hester Peirce, SEC commissioner, as you know, and who's spearheading the 3-year moratorium, on projects. Do you think that could be helpful?
I think Hester has certainly been a leader in thinking through the potential negative unintended consequences of the SEC's actions. And so I think that has been great. I have certainly looked at her kind of sandbox strategy. I don't know if that's the answer. I think that it's unlikely to hurt relative to where we are today. I would like to imagine that we could be more forward-leaning and provide some clarity. but I think that would be a positive step. I also think, I don't speculate that much on what happens in Washington, but with the recent news about Jay Clayton, potentially the current chair of the SEC, he was rumored to be taking the U.S. District Attorney for the Southern District of New York. I think that may change the balance of the dynamics at the top of the SEC anyway.
Well, and I think a world where maybe we aren't developing policy, to Brad's point that the absence of that is an advantage for China. The fact of having no policy is itself a policy, right? We see the same thing on the good side, right? I mean, we worry on the trade side about China overtaking us in manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, and the like. While we have on the Hill folks who are putting out a bunch of bills to maybe fund semiconductors and that kind of thing, but we're not seeing that come to fruition yet. And so just that the very absence of a policy, is its own comment on how the United States is going to approach it, whether it's intentional or not.
I mean, one thing that we are that is remarkable editorially as we cover these stories, taking a look at how innovation is fostered that right there in Silicon Valley, where you are, Brad, the heart of innovation for the past couple of decades. But it really comes from the private side. And so when it comes to really a capitalist driven, economy and democracy, that the private sector really pulls its weight when it comes to innovation. In China, that has obviously, that's geopolitically not the case, right? But what we are seeing is that it is top down authoritarian edict but when the government, when Xi Jinping decides to breathe life into blockchain industry, guess what? Every tier one city across China is now doing its own innovation hubs, it's financing, it's really smoothing and creating a frictionless environment for blockchain companies to innovate and grow. So you have two stark differences. What needs to happen on the side of Western democracies to even match and allow that innovation there, right there in Silicon Valley and certainly around the world to breathe and grow?
I think the obvious answer is you have to start with making sure that current regulations are not holding back. And, again, when I say that, I'm not talking about circumventing or quote, disrupting important regulatory frameworks. But there are examples where you can absolutely coexist with those important regulatory frameworks. We talked about some of them earlier around KYC and AML. And by no means do I think we need to upset those apple carts. When at Ripple, we talk about as almost a culture, we're not trying to be disruptive. We're trying to be constructive and working with the system and to take advantage of these new technologies. Now, Angie, I'll also say, as someone who's been in Silicon Valley for 23 years, in some ways, I don't think Silicon Valley is doing themselves a lot of favors when I see some of the big tech companies and even the Twitter hack from earlier this week. I think Silicon Valley also needs to take ownership and accountability and responsibility for some of the behaviors that aren't helping or constructive to earning the credibility and from both consumers and governments.
A lot of stepping up to do. But Jameson, what about on the government side? What about on the administration side? This or the next?
Right. I think part of this, and this is kind of a boring answer, but I think it is educating policymakers. We live in a world where, the dollar is still really strong. It has been. It's been, the reserve currency for decades and decades. And so it's hard for folks who are used to living in a world, who are used to regulating the dollar, to really understand the urgency of this. I think if part of the education is not just, hey, I want to be able to operate in the United States, but hey, we need to understand that other countries are getting ahead on this, and they're going to build this architecture if we don't. I mean, look what we're doing with sanctions. More and more, you're seeing Chinese nationals become subject to financial sanctions, which is a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, that's something that's going to accelerate China's use of a digital currency. So while we're actually doing things that, rightly or wrongly, are pushing China in that direction, what are we doing on our side? our people, our administrators, our lawmakers, our policy makers, they have to understand, why it's important for us to keep ahead in this race.
And so what do you think are I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'll just echo, I think Jameson is 100% right. And even if it is boring, and frankly, even the work the Digital Chamber is doing, Perry and Boring is doing, the education, it starts with education. I told I think Jameson had heard me tell this story recently, but when I first arrived in Davos at the World Economic Forum earlier this year, the first person I kind of talked to, they're like, hey, they said to me proactively, crypto is still kind of a bad word here. And I thought to myself, well, I'm not sure you understand exactly how crypto is being applied in constructive ways that is actually good for things like payment systems it's helping some of those that can least afford and don't have access to the financial system. So I think education, I just want to echo Jameson's answer. It's boring, but it's critically important.
And probably that person wasn't paying attention to World Economic Forum, efforts in blockchain. So maybe that person should pay a little bit more attention to what's going on. But in any case, what do you think the implications are for global financial infrastructure if a digital yuan is really kind of adopted outside of China, as you suggested, Jameson, used by countries in the Belt and Road efforts?
Right. Well, if you look at, look at the internet. Earlier Brad made the point that are we in a technological Cold War with China? And some would say yes. You see, China essentially has its own internet. No one ever thought that we'd have different internets in the world, but we do. So you could also see this happening turning into the same situation on the digital payment side, right? China has its client states. It has a lot of infrastructure projects all over the place. There are a lot of developing countries that need financing dollars. And it's not crazy to think that China will say, we'll help you develop your port, but you're going to pay us in the digital yuan, right? So I think that's a real risk that we have two financial systems in the world, as opposed to one that's led by, the United States and its like-minded allies.
Do you think public blockchain, public, crypto and, Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and things like that, is that a reasonable countermeasure response to potentially a CBDC or a digital currency from a sovereign?
The simple answer is yes. Putting it into effect is more complex, but I think the simple answer to that is yes, of course. The reality is, cryptocurrency is here to stay. It's not something that's going away. It's not a fad, and that goes back to part of the education I was talking about. I think a lot of policymakers and lawmakers think that it's a fad. They see the Twitter thing and they go, oh, see, it's just a scam, right? But it's not. It's here to stay, and it includes public digital currencies.
Well, that's a bet that Brad, you're making. Absolutely, you're building that infrastructure, that architecture of a tomorrow that we see coming. What are the challenges that you think you need to overcome?
Well, I would be beating a dead horse to talk more about the regulatory clarity challenge. Beyond that, certainly selling into a pandemic is a little bit tricky. We are seeing at Ripple both some headwinds because, getting in-person meetings, which has been the cornerstone of some of our sales efforts, is hard. But we're also seeing a lot of tailwinds. I have said publicly, I think the macro view on crypto in a world where you're seeing massive stimulus of fiat currencies, that's very inflationary over a longer arc of time, and I think that's probably very good for crypto. But I also think this isn't just about crypto as a speculative asset. It's about crypto using these technologies to solve real problems. And I think that over a longer arc of time is really where kind of quote unquote the promised land will be, for not just for what Ripple is doing in the XRP community, but really crypto on a broad base. And I think all boats can rise, absolutely. And so for me, it's, hey, we need to make sure there's regulatory clarity. We need to make sure we're focused on real use cases, not science experiments, but actually solving real problems. Silicon Valley has a reputation, I think deservedly, of sometimes having technologies in search of a problem which don't really go anywhere. And I think it's important that the various projects, regardless of what technology platform is being used, need to be clear about who their customer is and what problem they're solving?
The problems are many, but if education is going to be the key, what is the one thing that you want everybody in this audience, many of whom are those regulators and our agency folks, to consider as they move on into the second half of 2020?
James, you want to take that first? It's a big one.
Sure. Pay attention to the global context. Pay attention to the second order effects of other U.S. policies with respect to China in particular, and move very quickly to establish regulatory clarity.
Is that going to be enough, Brad?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can do much better than that. I agree 100%. I think that these are new technologies, and sometimes, particularly Capitol Hill, doesn't always dig a layer into those technologies. And understanding, to Jameson's point around education and knowledge, is critical. And to his point, if we don't understand the strategic moves being made by other countries, we won't know how to kind of adapt and react to that on a U.S. basis. So I agree with him wholeheartedly. And
absolutely, context and perspective is so important. It really, got to move beyond the headline and the superficial, just even the characteristics and the of a story. Got to dive deeper than that. And so I'm just very grateful to you for allowing us to do that these past 25 minutes. Brad Garlinghouse, Ripple CEO, and Jameson Greer, thank you so much for this very candid fireside chat.
Thank you, Angie.
Thanks to both of you. Thanks.